Alrighty, so continuing on with the appendicular skeleton, this is part 2B, which will take a look at the pelvic girdle as well as all the bones that are related to the lower body. Now, the pelvic girdle is more commonly known as our hip girdle or our hip joints, and it's going to be composed of two types of bone. You'll have your coxal bones, which are your hip bones, and the sacrum, which we were introduced to when we took a look at the vertebrate column. The function of the pelvic girdle is obviously to provide attachment to the lower limbs, but it will also be extremely important to allow us to carry the weight of our upper body, as well as to support our pelvic organs, such as our stomach, our intestines, our liver, our pancreas, and obviously also our reproductive organs. Now, as we're going to move along, what we'll take a look in the pelvic girdle is the fact that your hip bone, your coxal bone, is actually a fusion of three bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And we're also going to explore the acetabulum, which is a very deep socket where the head of the femur will fit in, allowing for the hip joint to be formed. Here in this illustration, you can see your pelvic girdle in its full array. So you can see the sacrum right in the middle, and then on either side, you're going to have your hip bones, also known as your coxal bones. Now, an interesting fact is that as children, we actually have more bones than as adults. So where do all these extra bones go? Well, it turns out that a lot of the bones will actually fuse during puberty, allowing for a larger bone to form. So for instance, your frontal bone as a child is actually consistent of both a left and a right side, but as an adult, it will fuse together so seamlessly that it will just look like one solid frontal bone making up that forehead. We see a very similar thing happening when we take a look at our ostcoxal bone or our hip bones. It is actually composed of three separate bones: the ilium, which is more on the side of the sacrum towards the top, the ischium, which is more towards the bottom part in the middle, and then the pubis part. The pubis is the most anterior part of the hip bone. It is also where we're going to be finding our pubic symphysium, which is going to be our cartilage that connects the two hip bones together. And it will also have an opening there, the appendicular foramen. This large opening is formed by what we like to call the rami and the body section of the pubis bones. Let's go ahead and take a look at some illustrations and highlight those three particular bones. So here you can see color-coded. Starting on top, you have the ilium. And then if you move towards the bottom, you're going to also see the ischium in purple. And then in an orangey shade, you'll have the pubis that's been highlighted for you. I also want to draw your attention to the acetabulum, which is going to be that deep socket where the head of the femur will fit in. And the appendicular foramen is another opening that comes off the pubis section. Here is a medial view of the bone, so you can see them connecting. And keep in mind that, and I'm reading this right off our study guide, for the ilium, you want to be able to realize that it attaches to the sacrum, and it's the top part of the hip bone. For the ischium, just know that it's part of the hip bone. And then for the pubis, for our notable structures, we do have the appendicular foramen and the pubic symphysis joint. On this one, we can see that there is a comparison between the male and the female pelvis. And as we're looking at this, one thing that you should note is that the female pelvis tends to be wider and lighter than the male pelvis. So the question is, why? And the answer to that is childbirth. Females from a genetic standpoint are formulated for childbearing. So what we're going to notice is that their hips will tend to be wider, further apart. This will allow for the fetus to grow during gestational period. And we also see that they tend to be a little bit thinner when it comes to the bone, making it slightly more flexible. In fact, if you look at the bottom of the illustration, you could see what they like to call the pubic arch, which is the opening between the two oscoccygeal bones. That little white section that's drawn in, that's the pubic symphysis. That's that connection point. And what we see happening is that the pubic arch is wider in females to make it easier for the hip bones to slightly separate and be more flexible during childbirth. Here you see it from a side view, and notice how even when we look at the sacrum, it will be wider in females, it will be a little bit shorter. Your coccyx bone, your little tailbone, will have a little bit more motility, and the notch will be definitely wider and shallow on the female end, all to accommodate the potential of another human entity growing inside of you. And here's another view at it. This one really highlights the fact that the pelvis in females are so much wider than that of males. Alrighty, so migrating down from the pelvic girdle, we're going to have our lower extremities that are attached to it, starting off with our thigh, leg, and foot region. So let's go ahead and take a look at what these lower limbs are. And as usual, we're referring to our study guide, and we're going to keep an eye out for those locational terms as well as the notable structures. So the first one is in your thigh region. You're going to have the largest and strongest bone that we have in the body, and that is the good old-fashioned femur. They did a study once to figure out exactly how strong the femur was, and I remember that what they did as part of their study is that they took a femur and a block of cement, and they were trying to see if they can get through the cement as it hardened. And it turns out that the femur is strong enough that it can actually crack the concrete as if enough pressure is applied to it. So I always thought that was a little interesting fact to share. Either way, the femur is going to be in the thigh region. It is the longest and the strongest bone. For many of us, it makes up about 1/4 of our overall height. And when we look at the femur, we're going to have to look for some notable structures. But one of the things that we're also going to come across will be our patella. Our patella is our kneecap, and it's an example of what we call a sesamoid bone. A sesamoid bone is a bone that's formed out of stress or applying pressure to it. So you're not actually born with a patella. It will only start to form when you start crawling and roaming around, and because of this pressure that's being placed on your lower extremities due to the locomotion, the patella will slowly form and take its place near the knee joint. So here are notable structures for the femur. We're going to have to be able to look at the head, which is the part of the femur that will attach to the acetabulum in our hip bones. We're also going to have to take a look at our condyles. This would be located towards the bottom part of the femur, and this will be our connection point with the tibia, our shin bone, and then also our epicondyles, because that will once again be our muscle attachments. Those will be the lowest entity of the femur. So here we see our illustration. As we can see, the femur is elongated, and as I mentioned before, it makes up about 1/4 of your overall height. You can see the head region, and notice how the head is a whole lot more pronounced in the femur than it is in the humerus, and part of that is because the head has to fit into the acetabulum, that deep socket in your hip bone. So it's a very sturdy joint. So if people go in for hip surgery or to have their hip joints removed, replaced, what they're usually having done is they're having metal attached to the head and the socket of the acetabulum to allow for an increased motility. The glenoid cavity in the humerus and the head of the humerus, they have more of a shallow connection. So that one isn't as sturdy as your pelvic girdle. You can also see on the left-hand side, if you go towards the bottom, labeled A, you have your patella, your little sesamoid bone, your kneecap. And then if you look back onto the right-hand side at the bottom of the femur, you can see that the condyle and the epicondyle have been labeled. Please keep in mind that the condyle will be the region that makes the connection with the tibia. And the epicondyle we're going to be discussing for its muscle attachments. Moving down the leg, we're going to see that we have our tibia and our fibula, and the tibia will be more towards the front. It will be our shin bone, and the fibula will be in the back. And one cool fact to kind of pronounce over here is, as you see on your PowerPoint, the tibia is an excellent weight-bearing bone, whereas the fibula has absolutely no function when it comes to weight-bearing. We do know that there are several muscles that will originate from it. Probably the best known muscle of that will be the soleus and the gastrocnemius, the muscles that are associated with your calf region. And if there ever comes a time where you need a bone transplant or you need a sample of your bone to be removed, oftentimes they will go ahead and take a piece of your fibula, because we know that because it doesn't wear any weight, it will not affect your locomotion. Very similar to our ulna and the radius, you're going to notice that on our illustrations, they will highlight the inner osseous membrane, which will be the connective tissue that wraps around the tibia and the fibula. So here's a look at the tibia and the fibula. The tibia, our shin bone, is more towards the front, and a little interesting fact about the tibia is that it's not fully covered by muscle, which means that it's exposed some of its nerve endings. That's what makes it so painful. If everybody has ever been kicked in their shin, it can be very painful because the force will make direct contact with the exposed nerves. You can also see the inner osseous membrane that has been highlighted. I also want to point out that on your study guide for both the tibia and the fibula, there are no specific notable structures to memorize. Just know that which one is the shin bone and the backbone, and obviously which one has the weight-bearing capacity, which would be the tibia, and which one does not, which is the fibula in the back. Now, as we keep moving all the way down the lower extremities, we get to our final location, the foot. And the foot, we're going to have to take a look at our tarsals, our metatarsals, and our phalanges. So some of you are going, but that sounds very familiar to the wrist. And you're correct, but the wrist and the hand overall will be our carpals, our metacarpals, and our phalanges. So if you see a mention of a carpal, we're looking at our upper extremities by our hand region. And if you see the mention of the tarsals, we're looking at our lower extremities. We're looking over to our foot region. Now, the tarsal itself will be composed of 7 bones. And what we see happening over here is that there's going to be one that's going to carry a lot of weight, and that's going to be our talus. And the calcaneus, that's going to be the heel of our foot. We're also going to come across the cuboid, the navicular, the medial, intermedial, and lateral cuneiform. And a quick way to keep those in order will be to look at our little red sentence, which is tiger cub needs milk. I don't make these up, but I do find them a little bit helpful to remember all the bones, primarily if we're looking at it in order. For our metatarsals, we're going to notice that very similar to our hand region, we're going to number them 1 through 5, 1 being by the big toe, which we're now going to call the hallux, and 5 being by your little toe. The actual toe parts will also be called phalanges, just like your fingers, and we're going to notice that they're also labeled 1 through 5, 1 being the big toe, the hallux, and 5 being the small toe, the little toe. And we're also going to see that very similar to when we looked at our fingers, you're going to have your phalanges be divided into 3 bones, the distal, the middle, and the proximal phalanges. And once again, the first digit, the hallux, will not have a middle phalange. So here we go. Here is our illustration. And as we can see on our right-hand side, it's been bracketed off to highlight the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. And within the tarsals, we can see our tiger cup needs milk, highlighting the bones that we need to know, which will be our talus. Remember, that's a weight-bearing one. The calcaneus, also weight-bearing. That one's our heel. And then we have our cuboid, our navicular, our medial cuneiform, our intermediate cuneiform, and our lateral cuneiform. Now, for the tarsals, you don't have to memorize the bones in order from proximal to distal, but I would like you to know which bones obviously collectively make up the tarsal, so know the name of all 7, and you definitely want to be able to highlight that the weight-bearing ones are the talus and the calcaneus, as well as that the calcaneus is what makes up your heel section. For your metatarsal, that makes up the top part of the foot, just please know that it's numbered 1 through 5, with 1 aiming towards the hallux and 5 towards the little toe. Same thing goes for your phalanges. These will make up your toes, numbered 1 through 5, each having a distal, middle, and proximal phalange, with the exception of the hallux, which will only have a distal and a proximal one. Now, to finish off our lecture on Chapter 7, I do want to quickly show you what we call the arches of the feet. Before we take a look at an illustration with the arches drawn in, I just want to show you the lateral view of the foot. And I like this view because it really does highlight the calcaneus, the heel region. And obviously, we can also see how the metatarsals and the phalanges fit into this whole scenario. All right, and as I mentioned to you before, this will be our last item to highlight in Chapter 7. These are called the arches of the foot, and it's basically a collection of the foot bones working together with ligaments and tendons, and their interlocking ability will allow us to form our longitudinal, transverse arches. And as you can see right there on the illustration on the right-hand side, it shows you the medial, the transverse, and the lateral. And basically what I would like you to know is that the arches are going to allow the foot to bear a lot of our weight. And please be able to describe that they are due to the fact that the bones have to interlock with both ligaments as well as tendons. Having said that, that includes our lecture on Chapter 7. Please keep in mind that we have discussion sessions that are open on Canvas, and I really encourage you to go ahead and put your questions, your comments, and your concerns there. And as always, I'm just an email away. So please keep studying, keep reviewing your notes, and hopefully we'll talk soon as we get closer and closer to our next exam.